Thank you. It's so much fun to be here in Newport. I've given this lecture on Bannister to Providence artists and by Zoom to historic New England, but it's really lovely to be in my hometown and see some familiar faces, so I hope you enjoy. My experience with the art and life of Edward M. Bannister, as well as the life of his wife, Christiana, a successful businesswoman, is threefold. I was guardian of Bannister's portrait of Christiana, as well as 2 landscapes during my tenure as curator at the Newport Art Museum, often exhibiting and speaking about them. In 2018, I organized an exhibition at the Gilbert Stuart Museum about the Bannisters called "My Greatest Successes Have Come Through Her," the artistic partnership of Edward and Christiana Bannister. She was quite a woman. With loans of some of the Bannisters' most important paintings now in the collections of major museums. And I chair the collections committee at the Providence Art Club, of which Bannister was a co-founder. And so I have been involved in a multi-layer effort known as the Bannister Community Art Project up at the Art Club. In 1886, Mitchell Bannister delivered a talk from a manuscript entitled "The Artist and His Critics," the only known surviving document stating the artist's philosophy. For this presentation, I have chosen the title "The Artist and His Influences" in order to discuss the multifaceted life and art of this important and talented 19th century painter who was black, Barbizon painter, marine painter, photographer, abolitionist, transcendentalist, spiritualist, and sailor. Bannister was all of these and more during his accomplished and eclectic life of 74 years. Edward Mitchell Bannister was born in the town of St. Andrews, New Brunswick, Canada in 1826. His father, also Edward, originally from Barbados, died when Bannister was around 4, and he and his brother William were raised by their mother, Hannah Alexander Bannister, a woman of Scottish heritage, either white or of mixed race, we don't know. Edward Bannister's earliest influence was his mother, of whom he said, "The love of art in some form came to me from my mother, who was born within a stone's throw of my birthplace on the banks of the St. Croix River. It was she who encouraged and fostered my childish propensities for drawing and coloring. She helped me with my lessons, which I was prone to neglect, for the more congenial work of drawing. As a black child in Canada, he was free to attend school, where he received a good elementary education. After his mother's death in 1844, Bannister and his younger brother went to live and work on the estate and farm of Harris Hatch in St. Andrews. Hatch, whose parents had been British loyalists from Boston during the Revolution, was a maritime trader, lawyer, and local legislator. If you go to St. Andrews today, known commercially as St. Andrews by the Sea, sort of like City by the Sea, you can stay at the Harris Hatch Estates, formerly the Harris Hatch Inn. The original Harris Hatch Estate is now the Ross Memorial Museum, on the right there, which recently hosted a small Bannister exhibition. Hatch apparently provided access to his extensive library to the impressionable young Bannister, who read and practiced his drawing skills by copying engravings and paintings in the family's collection. The New Brunswick Museum recently acquired some of these copies. Edward and his brother William, young men by the late 1840s, pursued their livelihood on fishing boats, like the one you see on the right, and coastal schooners off the coast of New Brunswick. This taste of life on the water proved alluring for Bannister, who was always to love sailing, sketching from boats and painting the shoreline. Today, at Toronto's Art Institute Canada, there is an educational program titled Maritime Environments and Industry Through the Art of Edward Mitchell Bannister. And as art historian Romare Bearden wrote, initially a cook, he became an expert sailor, alert to shifts in the winds and tides, and a student of the clouds. But most of all, his explorations on the seas opened his eyes to possibilities for his future as an artist, and he set his sights on Boston. And this is a very unique drawing of the point. I'm not quite sure how the coast has eroded since then or what part of the point it is, but it's one of my favorite places in Newport. Bannister scholar Juanita Holland has pointed out that Boston offered two important incentives to Edward Bannister: the chance to develop an identity as an African American and the direction to pursue his dream of being an artist. Boston had the third largest population of free blacks in the Northeast, and they formed a strong political community in the 1840s and 50s. Black Bostonians were founders and active participants in anti-slavery societies and other organizations, often centered at the African Meeting House on Beacon Hill, which you see on the left. And they gave meaning and support to the white abolitionists' endeavors, such as publishing William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator. As far as Bannister's aspirations for a career as an artist, Boston offered the promise of artistic instruction, the company of other artists, and the prospect of visiting art exhibitions. Reality settled in, however, as African-American author and activist William Wells Brown recounted in his 1863 book, which you can see there, The Black Man, his antecedents, his genius, and his achievements. Bannister, quote, turned his steps toward Boston with the hope that he might get a situation with a painter, never dreaming that his color would be a barrier to the accomplishment of such an object. Weeks were spent by the friendless, homeless, and penniless young man, and every artist had seen his face and heard his wish to become a painter. Despite its reputation for abolition and supporting freedmen, racism, discrimination, and segregation prevailed in Boston. Free black men of the middle class supported themselves by becoming barbers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and shoemakers, among other professions. Bannister and his brother William were both listed as hairdressers and as mulattoes in the Boston census of 1850, which you can see up there on your right. Edward aged 23 and William aged 20. By 1855, Bannister was listed as a barber at 190 Commercial Street in Boston. Nevertheless, Bannister pursued his artistic impulses and made portraits of his acquaintances, including the eminent black physician Dr. John V. DeGrasse and his wife, Lucretia Cordelia Howard DeGrasse. Dr. DeGrasse's sister, Serena, married Newport's George Downing, so the two became close friends. Successful African Americans were eager to be portrayed accurately and with dignity by members of their own race. William Cooper Nell, African-American writer for The Liberator and abolitionist, wrote a book in 1855 that included biographical sketches of prominent African Americans. At that early date, Bannister was acclaimed for his crayon portraits, as well as the beautiful painting, The Ship Outward Bound, hanging in DeGrasse's study. This early commission, location unknown, but noted in The Liberator under the heading Colored Genius, depicted a ship under full sail departing for another harbor. Boats, harbors, and inland waterways were the subject of many of Bannister's sketches. Only a few of Bannister's paintings from the 1850s are known. His untitled Rhode Island seascape from about 1856, with its flat decorative quality, lies somewhere between American folk painting and imitations of contemporary paintings that he might have seen. The locale, possibly Second Beach in Middletown, Rhode Island, indicates Bannister was visiting the Rhode Island coast. While Dorchester, Mass, on the right, shows a developing sense of perspective, there is little form or structure to the landforms and buildings. In both cases, Bannister demonstrates his awareness of cloud formations and tidal movements. While little of Bannister's artwork from the 1850s exists, evidence of his participation in Boston's black community does. He became friends with African-American artists Jacob Andrews and William Simpson and developed an appreciative following. Along with Simpson, he joined the Crispus Attucks Choir and attended performances at their political and social events, singing anti-slavery songs. Bannister apparently had a good tenor. Simpson painted portraits in a neoclassical style of abolitionists, including his famous Bishop Germain Logun, pardon my mispronunciation if I do, who escaped slavery to become an important Underground Railroad conductor. Bannister, along with Simpson and Andrews, was a member of the Black Histrionic Club, Boston's first black drama group. Most significant of all, Bannister entered into the circle of Christiana Carteaux, a successful black businesswoman and abolitionist who operated hair salons in Boston and Providence. Madame Carteaux, as she was known in her numerous ads in the Liberator, one of which you can see on the left, was also of mixed race, having been born Christiana Babcock in North Kingstown, Rhode Island, of African and Narragansett Indian descent. This portrait on the right, which I will speak more of later, is the only identified image of her. She was 6 years older than Bannister and had come to Boston, the Boston area, in the mid-1840s. Likely because her brother, James Babcock from North Kingstown, married Cecilia Remond, a hairdresser and member of an African-American family from Salem, Massachusetts, respected for their hairdressing and catering businesses. The Remond family, headed by James and Nancy Remond, had moved to Newport in 1835. So that their children could attend the African Free School run by the African Benevolent Society located on Mary Street. The family bought a house on Thames Street and established a hairdressing business called the Perfumery and Dressing Room, which you can see an ad for on the right. Cecilia Remond, who I don't have a photo of, in her 20s, worked as a hairdresser. She likely met James Babcock in Newport. Cecilia's older brother, Charles Lennox Remond, who was to become an important abolitionist and orator, friend of Frederick Douglass, addressed the Rhode Island Anti-Slavery Society in 1837 when he was 27 and was immersed in numerous anti-slavery activities while living in Newport. Cecilia's younger sister, Sarah Parker Remond, attended the Newport School, also becoming an important abolitionist and orator, and eventually moving to Italy to become a physician. Her portrait is on the right. The family returned to Salem in 1841. John M. Rice's informative article in the summer-fall 2022 Newport History Journal discusses the Remond family in Newport. All these familiar connections undoubtedly influenced Christiana to herself become active in Boston's abolitionist community. Christiana had married a cigar maker named Dessalines Carteaux in 1840, but had left the marriage by the early 1850s. The 1855 Boston census shows she and Cecilia Babcock were living and working together as hairdressers. Although little is known about Christiana's training or aspirations, it is clear that she had an entrepreneurial spirit, and by the 1850s, she operated hair salons at various Boston addresses and promoted herself as a hair doctress, advertising that ladies can be waited upon at their own residence or at her rooms, which will be open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. She has numerous recommendations from the fashionable community of Boston, Providence, and elsewhere. Records show that in 1853, Bannister was working as a barber in Christiana's Boston hair salon. In 1857, the two married, an event deemed worthy enough to be announced in the Liberator. Christina Carteaux was Bannister's earliest and most important patron. The first decade of their relationship saw the rise of the artist's career. He was listed as ambrotypist in the 1857 Boston City Directory, an ambrotype being an early photograph, and by 1859, Edward Bannister was listed as a portrait painter. As William Wells Brown wrote in 1863, "Mr. Bannister possesses genius which is now showing itself in his studio in Boston, for he has long since thrown aside the scissors and the comb and transfers the face to the canvas instead of taking the hair from the head. His portraits are correct representations of the originals, and he is daily gaining admirers of his talent and taste." According to creditable research, in 1859, the Bannisters boarded for a time at the home of Lewis and Harriet Hayden, now 66 Phillips Street on Beacon Hill in Boston, on the left. The Hayden home was the preeminent Underground Railroad safe house, and the Haydens, themselves formerly enslaved, devoted themselves to protecting others who were being hunted after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. You can see Hayden's and William Cooper Nell's broadside expressing their feelings about this act on the right. Bannister was listed in the 1859 tax records as working as a painter in a building adjacent to the Haydens. In 1861, the Bannisters were living at the home of Reverend Leonard Grimes, a pastor and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. His church, the 12th Street Baptist, was known as the Fugitive Church for its efforts in aiding fugitive slaves. These integral persons and locations indicate the Bannisters were immersed in the cause and met many of its leaders, and indeed Bannister became secretary to a number of abolitionist causes, including the New England Colored Citizens Convention, where he served as a delegate. Likely looking for new sources of income, Bannister was listed in the city directory in 1863 as a photographist. He had been learning photographic techniques and became aware of the carte de visite, a less expensive and more easily reproduced image than a daguerreotype. African Americans embraced this medium, wanting to record themselves for history. African Americans embraced this medium, and Bannister created 3 carte de visite, exhibited recently as part of the Harriet Hayden scrapbooks acquired by the Boston Athenaeum. Bannister's photographs depict 2 eminent black men and 1 woman. Dr. John DeGrasse, whom Bannister painted 10 years earlier, stands in full Union Army uniform as part of the Colored Infantry Regiment. Pastor Leonard A. Grimes, with whom the Bannisters had stayed in 1861, was antebellum Boston's most aggressive black minister, helping fugitive slaves escape by way of the Underground Railroad and through his church. The woman photographed by Bannister identified as Jane Howe Watson, Mrs. Thomas R., is unknown. But those are Bannister's 3 carte de visite. The Civil War had begun in 1861, and the Bannisters were politically involved. He served as recording secretary of the Union Progressive Association, led by William Cooper Nell. Bannister was witness to speeches by Frederick Douglass and other black leaders on January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln announced the Emancipation Proclamation. Shortly after that, Governor John Andrew of Massachusetts was able to form the 1st Regiment of Black Soldiers, the famous 54th Regiment, which you see on your left. In her capacity as president of the Colored Ladies Relief Society, Christiana Bannister traveled with Governor Andrew, William Lloyd Garrison, and Frederick Douglass to present flags to the regiment. Christiana also became president of the Colored Ladies Sanitary Committee, which organized a fair to raise money for disabled black veterans and their families. The 1864 Colored Ladies Fair featured a portrait of the 54th Regiment's leader, Robert Gould Shaw, painted by Edward Bannister. And you can see it mentioned there on the right. It was to be raffled and, according to one story, hung in the Boston State House. But it disappeared, has never been located. Now, let's see. Bannister's career as a photographer was short-lived, and by 1865 he was listed as artist in the Boston City Directory. Undoubtedly, the Bannisters' high profile in the abolitionist community, both black and white, helped his career. William Wells Brown's 1863 book cited 2 paintings on which Bannister was at work. One, a history painting, and the other a genre scene, both unknown today. In 1864, Bannister received a commission to paint a posthumous portrait of Prudence Nelson Bell, the mother of an African-American friend of William Lloyd Garrison. He painted it from her coffin, according to a family descendant, and the work likely suffers from not having a live model, as there is a little sense of three dimension. By then, Bannister was acclaimed enough to have moved into Boston's studio building, on your right, sometime between October 1864, when the Liberator advertised his services there as a portrait painter. The studio building at the corner of Tremont and Bromfield Street was the city's most prominent space for working artists. Well-known American artist William Morris Hunt had worked there until 1864, and when Bannister moved in, he might have run into John Lafarge or Elihu Vedder or the African-American sculptor Edmonia Lewis. Bannister's reputation was such that a white artist, John Nelson Arnold, upon recommendation, went to view his work and noted that it, quote, bore the undoubted hallmark of genius. Arnold became Bannister's colleague, and the two were further acquainted while taking evening courses in anatomical drawing at Boston's Lowell Institute with William Rimmer, a self-taught artist who also practiced medicine. Rimmer, a Renaissance man originally from England, offered the first thorough instruction based on the human figure to be given in Boston. As per the founding of the Lowell Institute, classes were free and open to all, regardless of race or gender. This was to be Bannister's only formal art instruction. Another very significant influence in the trajectory of Bannister's painting career was an exhibition held at the Studio Building in 1866 of the newly formed Alston Club, named after the artist Washington Alston, whose poems Bannister owned. Organized by William Morris Hunt and some of his Boston friends, the exhibition featured work by contemporary French artists with whom Hunt became familiar when living in France. Gustave Courbet, acclaimed for his bold realistic paintings, was one. Jean-Francois Millet, known for his stoic portrayals of peasants at work, was another. Both these iconic paintings were shown at the Studio Building when Bannister was at work there. Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, celebrated for his spontaneous yet poetic landscapes, was a very popular artist in Boston. Another artist whose influence on Bannister can't be discounted was Thomas Robinson, an animal painter and close friend of Hunt from Providence, Rhode Island, who spent much time scouting out paintings in France for Hunt and his friend gallery owner Seth Vos. Bannister's paintings from the late 1860s reflect these newfound French influences. Two untitled works with cows and figures indicate Bannister's study of anatomy, both human and animal, and the realism of modern French painting. Herdsmen with Cows incorporates the progress Bannister has made with landscape and perspective, and as well with humans and animals. His untitled Moon over Harbor hints at the poetic reverie of what was to come and shows Bannister's awareness of Corot and others. William Morris Hunt had been making Boston the center of access to this new kind of painting, dubbed the Barbizon School for its origins in the French forest of that name. You can see his Girl with Cows on the left, derivative of French painters such as Millet. The Barbizon School, itself deriving from the paintings of John Constable and J.W. Turner in England, advocated for an emotional rather than an intellectual approach to painting nature. John Arnold, Bannister's friend, wrote, "Bannister from the first felt the impulse of the Barbizon School. His trend of mind and his sympathies were all in that direction." Perhaps that was one of the reasons the Bannisters relocated from Boston to Providence, Rhode Island, in 1869, although he continued to exhibit in Boston and maintained clients there. Bannister seemed to have discovered that landscape painting was his métier, and Rhode Island offered unsurpassed coastal vistas as well as the rural quietude of shadowy trees and light-filled fields and pastures. Painting the Rhode Island landscape offered Bannister a way to nurture his feelings of connectedness with the land and the sea. Another suggested reason for the move was the increased racial tension in Boston after the Civil War, with an influx of the formerly enslaved from the South and rising resentment among Irish immigrants. Providence was also the home to Seth Fose's gallery, you can see over there on your right, that very early on offered examples of the French painters, and you can see a Millet in the window of the Westminster Street Art Gallery. In addition, Rhode Island was Christiana Bannister's native state. She already had a hair salon there, and Bannister had visited in earlier times. Christiana continued to encourage her husband's painting aspirations. Undoubtedly, her organizational skills and business acumen, and definitely her finances, were helpful to his career. Sometime, likely in the late 1860s, Bannister painted his wife, a portrayal of great dignity and charm that you can see in the center. The portrait presents a handsome, statuesque woman in contemporary fashion in a domestic setting. She has strong features, penetrating eyes, and high cheekbones. One contemporary account noted her Native American appearance, and she was often assigned the Indian roles in productions of the Histrionic Club. In this portrait, Christiana is more integrated into the space than some of Bannister's former portrait subjects, showing the artist's increasing skills. And as Bannister dealer Corrine Jennings has noted, Bannister's photograph of Jane Howe Watson in the same decade resembles the composition of the painted portrait of Christiana. So you can see the same, sort of the same pose in the photograph he took of that woman. Another woman in a carte de visite from the Harriet Hayden albums, although unidentified and photographed by T.R. Burnham and not by Bannister, to my eye, closely resembles Madame Carteaux, who would have been a likely candidate for a carte de visite, but you can't prove it. One of Bannister's earlier Rhode Island paintings was Governor Sprague's White Horse, in which a man grooms a spirited horse, seen on your right. Bannister would have seen animal paintings by Rosa Bonheur in the Alston Club exhibition, and perhaps even her famous Horse Fair, which was shown in New York in the late 1850s. The powerful horse depicted by Bannister was the second one that Governor William Sprague of Rhode Island rode in the Battle of Bull Run, the first having been shot out from under him, in the collection of the Rhode Island Historical Society. Although Providence was just as segregated as Boston, the art community welcomed Bannister. The Providence Press in 1869 took note of his arrival, mentioning the recent exhibition of his portrait of William Lloyd Garrison, location unknown, and a portrait of a young newsboy with its spontaneous realism, showing the stylistic influence of its Boston colleagues, especially Hunt, whose portrayals on the left of a young Italian boy you can see. Thematically, Bannister's The Newsboy relates to Millet's idea of respecting the worker, as the subject appears to be a young African American pursuing his job as a newspaper boy. By 1870, Bannister had a studio at the Mercantile National Bank building with 3 other artists and was listed as a portrait and landscape painter. Soon, Bannister was sharing studio space in the Woods building at the foot of College Hill with his colleague John Arnold and other prominent artists. He and Christiana eventually moved to a home at 93 Benevolent Street, where they resided for 14 years, and this home was recently restored by Brown University. You can see it on your right. Contemporary accounts described Bannister's popularity. Arnold wrote of his genial, kindly, courteous nature which followed him through his life. In 1872, he won an award at the Rhode Island Industrial Exhibition for an unknown landscape titled Summer Afternoon, and had a landscape exhibited at the Boston Art Club in 1873. Bannister's star was ascending, and in 1876, his large landscape, and when I say large, it was 48 by 78 inches, was juried by way of the Massachusetts Centennial into the national exhibition, the Philadelphia Centennial, where it won one of 4 first prize medals. Under the oaks, the location unknown since somewhere around 1900, was painted on the grounds of the William Goddard Estate in East Greenwich, and according to newspaper critics, featured a grove of old gnarled oaks beneath which a shepherd watches a flock of sheep. A preparatory drawing exists in the catalog of the Massachusetts Artist Centennial album, which you can see on your left, and a similarly titled painting from that same year, 1876, offers clues. The sketchy quality of the drawing for Under the Oaks was characteristic of many studies that Bannister completed, some in a scrapbook in the Archives of American Art, others in various collections. The certificate for Bannister's award is in the collection of the Providence Art Club, recently conserved by the Northeast Document Conservation Center. I drove it up and back. It used to be totally murky yellow. The story has often been told of how Bannister elbowed his way to the front of the crowd at the exhibition because he had heard that number 54, his painting, had won an award. He was rudely received by an insolent official, but when Bannister announced that he was the artist of the award-winning painting, the crowd suddenly changed its attitude and began, quote, bowing and scraping to him. Numerous stories have inferred that the jury tried to retract the award when they found out the artist was black, but that has been proven inaccurate. Certainly there was racism among the audiences, but the jury included artists from abroad who were long gone when Bannister received the award. The late 1870s saw Bannister find his direction in landscape painting and embrace the loose brushwork and broader use of pigment in his paint application. Details are often lost in the thick impasto. Examples include this small oil sketch of a beach in Warwick, Rhode Island, and the ocean scene in Newport. Both works have a feeling of on-site immediacy, with thick painterly brushstrokes and abstracted forms. Bannister felt more free to personally interpret nature and work in plein air. Trees continued to be a favorite subject for Bannister. His manipulation of light and shadow served to soften forms and obscure detail, contrary to paintings of the Hudson River School. It was likely that his great friendship with painter George Whitaker aided and abetted his new style. While Bannister never studied in Europe, he met Whitaker shortly after that artist returned from absorbing the Barbizon influences of France. And that's Whitaker's work on your left. In addition, at the Providence Gallery of Seth Vos, Bannister would have seen works by French Barbizon painters such as Corot, Charles d'Aubigny, and Narcisse Virgilio Diaz, whose work I think offered a role model for both Whitaker and Bannister. You can see his work on the right. Bannister commanded, where'd I go? Bannister commanded great respect after his Centennial Award in Providence, Boston, and nationally. People now listen to him, as indeed George Whitaker wrote. His opinions were of a decided nature, for they were invariably well-grounded. In 1878, Bannister convened with fellow artists to discuss forming the Providence Art Club. Providence's burgeoning number of artists wanted to sell their work. They wanted an appreciative audience, and they wanted to be in direct contact with collectors. It took 2 years of haggling, but in May 1880, 16 men and women signed a compact with Bannister's signature second to the top. You can see on the left. His silhouette occupies the first space in what is called the Green Room at the Art Club. Bannister was on the executive committee that organized the Providence Arts Club's first exhibition, held in a hall rented from the newly formed Rhode Island School of Design. He was on the jury for the Rhode Island School of Design's first exhibition by non-students in 1880 1905. Bannister was not, however, one of the original board directors of RISD, as has been erroneously noted by some, nor did he teach there, although he did have many private pupils in Saturday classes, and he mentored young artists such as Charles Walter Stetson, whose portrait of him is on the left. A sketch portrait recently acquired by a friend of mine. Both white and black collectors began to acquire Bannister's work. Philanthropist Isaac Comstock Bates, whose gifts formed the backbone of RISD's early collection, eventually gave the institution 5 Bannisters, including the just viewed oil sketch at the Oakside Beach. The collection of Providence's Joseph and Edward Ely included over a dozen Bannisters. Mrs. Jessie Metcalf, founder of RISD, and her daughter Eliza Radke, later RISD president, owned Bannister paintings. George Whitaker owned many Bannisters, and Bannister's friend, Civil War hero and Judge George Bliss, acquired 3 paintings from the artist. The black soprano Ciceretta Jones of Providence collected his work, as did other African-American leaders such as George Downing and John Hope. In 1883, Bannister joined with his fellow artists to form the Ann Eliza Club, known as the AE Club, an outgrowth of the Providence Art Club, except no women were allowed, in which the members discussed, lectured, and demonstrated art and ideas. It was here in 1886 where Bannister delivered his talk, The Artist and His Critics, in which he disparaged art critics who did not understand artists. He also defended Millet against the critics. He was not about social unrest and said he was the most sympathetic artistic spirit of our time. In this manuscript, Bannister set down his idea that it is the artist's purpose to interpret the central spiritual idea of subjective truth involved in material being, and the critic's duty to try and grasp the artist's intentions. For Bannister, art was a spiritual expression. Some recent research has suggested that Bannister's ideas sprang from his knowledge of German idealism, the philosophy that reality is made up of ideas and dependent on the activity of the mind. In his extensive reading and study, Bannister encountered the teachings of the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, who believed that the artist interpreted the ideal creations of the universal soul. He also admired the poetry and transcendentalist ideas of Washington Allston, whom he mentioned in his talk and whose work you can see on the left. Undoubtedly, Bannister was influenced by the mystical philosophy of Swedenborgianism, I always have trouble with this, Swedenborgianism, which held that objects in nature are permeated by a spiritual force. Both George Whitaker and his mentor, the great landscape painter George Inness, were Swedenborgians. And Inness, in his late painting, epitomized his belief that nature was imbued with the divine. Bannister seemed to acquiesce when he wrote that the artist becomes an interpreter of the infinite, subtle qualities of the spiritual idea centering in all created things, revealing to us glimpses of the absolute idea of perfect harmony. His paintings of the 1880s reveal these beliefs. Animals and humans were usually not central to the composition, but instead portrayed as part of the harmonious universe. The winding road or path, which you see in many of his paintings, indicated one's passage through God's territory. As I have noted, Bannister was a great sailor, and he acquired a sailboat named Fanchon, meaning freedom or free one, in 1884. He was presumably a member of the Rhode Island Yacht Club, as he was on their nominating committee and entered his boat in a race in 1887. In 1890, a New York paper noted that Newport sculptor William Clark Noble of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument here in Newport and others went to Providence to join Bannister on his yacht. I just recently discovered the delightful Jamestown Harbor at Newport at sunset on the right in the collection of the Jamestown Historical Society. In his 30-foot cat yawl, he navigated the inlets and harbors of Narragansett Bay, making sketches and studies of his surroundings. The Providence Journal, under Art Gossip in September 1889, noted, "With cabin full of marine sketches, Mr. E.M. Bannister has sailed back from Newport, where he has been spending the greater part of the summer on his yacht. He has been unusually active in out-of-door work, and his sketches include notes from the quite landlocked coves and others from the rocky face of the coast." As George Whitaker wrote, "For more than 25 years he sailed his small yachts in Narragansett Bay and Newport Harbor. I have had the pleasure of being in his company on his boat for weeks at a time, and I fancy that here he made his mental studies. These were the days when his cup of joy was full." The resulting major paintings demonstrate Bannister's plein air capabilities, his interest in the clouds, the sky, the reflections in the water. The Palmer River is a masterful example recently acquired by the National Gallery from Providence collector Dan Metchnig. Bannister's massed forms of greens and blues, as well as wide swaths of paint applied in horizontal bands, combined to give this painting a modernist feel, as well as a reverential tone. The Palmer River is located in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. In Sabine Point, Narragansett Bay, Bannister tempers his interpretation of nature's beauty with his awareness of the effects of weather. The swaying beach grasses, the wind-swept sailboats, the billowing clouds, all painted with an expressive brush. Originally owned by George Whitaker, when Sabine Point was exhibited in Bannister's memorial exhibition, a critic noted that it was painted at the zenith of the artist's career and that a blue mist stretches like a lake across the center, surrounding itself with purple and golden splendor. And it is quite spectacular. It's at Brown University. It was here in a show at the Newport Art Museum I did in 2007. And the Palmer River was in the recent Bannister show I did. The Bannisters reportedly rented a summer cottage in Newport in the 1880s. Bath Road Cliff depicts a site off what is now Memorial Boulevard. A leisurely couple perches on a ledge looking out to sea, where a rigged ship is visible, while in the upper right, two diminutive figures traverse a path. Human activity is very peripheral to the forces of the waves and swirling clouds in the heavens. However, a painting such as Bath Road Cliff deserves further research, as has been pointed out by scholars. Are those concentric circles formed by the clouds metaphors for circles of light or heavenly radiance? Are those rigged ships in the distance, seen in other paintings, references to slave ships? Other paintings seem to be straightforward celebrations of the beauty of Aquidneck Island. The Path Home is a spectacular painting in the tradition of Worthington Whitridge's Barbizon scenes of Aquidneck Island. This appears to be a view of the Sakonnet River with the northern end of Statues Point visible, now the Statues Point National Wildlife Refuge, possibly Third Beach to the right. A small solitary figure climbs the meandering path from the buildings below. A newspaper article in 1892 reported that Bannister's studio contained many sketches and watercolors executed the previous summer in Newport. Edward and Christiana were friends of prominent African-American businessman and entrepreneur George Downing since their early days in Boston, when, as previously mentioned, Downing married the sister of Bannister's patron, John de Grasse. The Downings now lived in Newport. As Bannister's friend George Forbes, the African-American Boston Public Library librarian, recounted, the last time the present writer saw the Bannisters was at Newport in the summer of 1893, where the artist and his wife had come in their yacht to spend a few days at the house of the Venerable George T. Downing. and the numerous paintings which he has left us with seaside names and suggestions speak well for the sailor lad that he sailed in his boat on the bay. More than one colleague asserted that Bannister in the end was his own master and followed no school. This is evident throughout his career, and particularly in many of his later works, which reintroduced figurative and religious themes. W. Alden Brown, one of Bannister's pupils in the 1890s, wrote that the artist was thoroughly conversant with the Bible, Shakespeare, English literature, classic themes, and mythology. On the left is Lacotia rescuing Ulysses from 1891, up in the administrative offices at the Newport Hospital, if they haven't done something with it, commissioned for George Moulton Carpenter. In Greek mythology, Lacotia was a sea goddess famed for rescuing sailors. Here she offers a veil to Ulysses, who is in distress, clinging to the side of the raft. The faces and figures are indistinct, loosely painted with the shimmering moon casting a spell over all. On the right is people near boat, much more matter-of-factly painted. Although Bannister did not normally portray African American figures, perhaps he thought they would not be saleable, the man on the left resembles the artist himself. No Bannister painting has stimulated as much discussion as The Hay Gatherers of 1893. Considered one of Bannister's masterpieces, The Hay Gatherers is important on a number of levels. The interplay of trees, sky, and horizon in a light-filled atmosphere creates an expansive yet intimate landscape. Workers in the field are indicative of the French Barbizon influence, which acknowledged the reality and dignity of laborers. Here, two figures are black, a rare allusion by Bannister to race. This fact has led some to speculation that Bannister was referring to Rhode Island's plantation system, which had been centered in the fields of South County, as well as the history of slavery in the state. This theory bears further research, but as others have pointed out, Bannister usually avoided themes of race. Not so for Christiana Bannister, however, who was a tireless advocate for older black women no longer able to work as domestics. In the 1880s, she began working with others, calling upon her contacts among affluent white women to found the Home for Aged Colored Women, later known as Bannister Nursing Care Center. In 1890, the home opened with Christiana and two other prominent African Americans on the corporation, the Reverend Mahlon Van Horn of Newport, on your left, and George Henry, formerly enslaved, a wealthy entrepreneur and Providence activist. In 1892, Edward Bannister joined the advisory board, exhibiting his painting of Christ healing the sick, and donated the portrait of his wife to the home. It's now in the collection of the RISD Museum. The Providence Journal continually reported on Bannister's paintings, exhibitions, and activities. The newspaper noted that because of health concerns, Bannister wanted to sell his boat, and sometime in the early 1890s it was acquired by his friend Judge George Bliss, who you see on your left. This is a photo of the two of them on Fanshawe. The influence of sailing on Bannister is referenced in an interesting drawing in the Smithsonian from 1882. A disconsolate mother sits below a print of a boat while her son plays at her feet with a toy sailboat. Titled Sad Memories, it is possibly a reference to Bannister's childhood and the loss of his father at sea. As the century neared its end, Bannister's paintings brightened considerably. In a documented conversation in the 1880s with his good friend and colleague, Charles Walter Stetson, they both agreed that they had no use for Impressionism. But the untitled Rhode Island landscape of 1898 tells a different story. This painting adorned the cover of the catalog for the important Bannister exhibition organized by Kenkeleba House, New York in 1991, and which came to the Newport Art Museum. As Juanita Holland wrote, The painting indicates a willingness to experiment with a more abstract ordering of forms and color and an increasing attention to the textural qualities of paint. Similarly, in the old home owned by the Providence Art Club, gone are the somber tones and shadowy trees, replaced by pastel blues, greens, and a light-filled terrain. But changing tastes in art inevitably left Bannister behind, and he may have become disillusioned with the negative stereotypes of black people that began to proliferate around him. His health was deteriorating. Several of his colleagues had moved from Providence, and an economic downturn affected patronage. Bannister quit the AE Club. He moved to a studio in Boston for the year of 1899, and upon his return to Providence in 1900, he did not exhibit at the art club. His friend John Arnold observed that Bannister's mind had become clouded, and physically he was not in good shape, with reported health problems. But he painted until the end, suffering a fatal heart attack at a church meeting in January 1901. Bannister's colleagues at the Providence Art Club worked to remedy George Whitaker's question of a decade earlier, quote, "Is it right that a man of such power should be allowed to slip through our community without due recognition?" They arranged a 7-foot stone monument over his grave in the North Hill Burying Ground. They organized a memorial exhibition at the Providence Art Club of May of 1902 with 101 of his works. The Providence papers had great tributes. After her husband's death, Christina moved into the Home for Aged Colored Women, but suffering from dementia, she was transferred to the State Hospital for the Insane, where she died in January 1903. She was buried next to her husband, but with no marker for her grave. Nancy K. Anderson, curator at the National Gallery, has stated that Edward Bannister is now, almost 200 years after his birth, recognized as a key figure in the history of American landscape painting. Murray White, the Boston Globe's art critic, recently echoed that thought in an article. Canadian art historians are eager to reclaim Bannister as their own. He never became an American citizen. Today, we know that Bannister created upwards of 1,000 works with ongoing efforts to identify and date them. Anne Louise Avery of Great Britain is compiling a catalogue raisonné and writing a biography. The Smithsonian American Art Museum owns over 100 works, many of them needing conservation and research. Providence historian and teacher Michael McGugan has created an indispensable bibliography and resource book on Bannister, which you can see here on the right, with the iconic cover photo of Bannister, owned by the Newport Historical Society. And you have that in your library. In 2018, I guest curated an exhibition called My Greatest Successes Have Come Through Her, the artistic partnership of Edward and Christiana, and you can see a picture from that up on the right. That was at the Gilbert Stuart Museum. Bannister's paintings are in many public and private collections. The Providence Art Club led efforts under the auspices of the Bannister Community Art Project for a full-size Bannister sculpture in Market Square. And there I am sitting with Bannister by the Providence River. That memorial was created by Gage Prentice, the sculptor of the Art Club's bust of Bannister, which you see on the left. Finally, Corinne Jennings, director of Kenkellaba Gallery, wrote in her 1991 catalog that she hoped her exhibition would lead eventually to a definitive one, and plans are in the works for a major traveling exhibition. I am on the advisory committee for this exhibition to take place in the next few years. Here you see the Newport Historical Society's beautiful Bannister painting, the gift of Mrs. Harriet Jackson Phelps. The research of numerous scholars and others has formed the content for this talk, including Linda Hartigan, Corinne Jennings, Juanita Holland, Romare Bearden, Jane Lancaster, Roger King, Ed Shine, Catherine Littleburt, Gwendolyn Dubois Shaw, and Tracy Lee Costa. I find the sentiments of George Whitaker delivered in a lecture in 1891 at the AE Club to be the most apt to describe his friend and his work. Quote, "Seldom going outside of himself, he gives us what his mind's eye beholds, And in Facing Nature, he first gets his picture by twisting and turning objects in his composition to suit his fancy, digesting well what he appropriates, in this way obtaining the best results. The idealist sees most with closed eyes, and our friend is an active member of this class. Thank you.